a Jewish organization dictate that I should not mention the number of days remaining between now and Pesach. That I should not mention the number of days between now and Pesach. So, with an undisclosed number of days remaining between now and Pesach, Pesach is arguably the Jewish holiday most focused on education and the education of our children. The scriptural frame for two of the four questions that our children ask at the Seder, or about which we speak about children asking at the Seder, are two psukim that begin, V'haya ki yish'alcha bincha machar lemor. When your child asks you in a future time, say it. Tonight I want to homiletically interpret that pasuk as, when your child asks you about machar, about the future. Implicitly and explicitly, our children force us to consider machar, to consider the future. Their future and the future of their education and the future of Jewish education. And it's that question that we're excited and proud to have our Bayit convening to discuss tonight. So I want to thank you, offer words of thank you to our panelists, from whom I have learned a lot in my life, to Menachem and Yael, from whom I learn a lot every day, to our building staff who make this space welcoming and possible, to Avi Bloom and all those who are helping us with tech tonight, and to our Adult Ed Committee who offered some of the inspiration and thinking behind this mini-series, and finally, to our wonderful moderator from the previous panel and this one, who's really helped us think broadly and deeply about Jewish education, and it's my pleasure to introduce her now, Nina Bruder.
Thank you. Thank you, Rev. Stephen. How is this on sound? It's okay? This is feeding also into the live stream, so that's why we are also on mics, even though it's a smaller space. But it looks like it's a little too high. Are we good? Oh, that's better. Okay. Welcome, everybody, to the second and final panel in the Bayit series on Jewish education. The first panel was exactly 3 weeks ago tonight, and it addressed the question of how is the community doing regarding the enterprise of Jewish education. We heard from 3 talented educators from 3 exciting institutions. And for those of you who weren't here, the session was recorded and is available on the YouTube Bayit channel. Education is a core principle in Jewish life, hence the title of this series, V'shinantam levanecha, and you shall teach your children. As we established last month, Jewish education is a very broad and very dimensional topic. This series focuses primarily on educating children, primarily elementary school, middle school, and high school children, less so on early childhood. And I'll say we have a bias toward day schools, but it's not the only thing we're going to talk about by any means. We're living in really historic times. Every generation probably says that, but I believe that now, in this day and age, with the invention of the microchip and the internet and the proliferation of cell phones and mobile devices, we have had the effect of decentralizing authority and increasing global communication and pace of change in ways that are literally altering the course of world history. In my opinion, we are smack dab in the middle of the beginning of the next era that the history books will write about. I learned recently through a program actually sponsored by the Idea Schools Network that our current system of educating children is over 100 years old, where we have a building that divides the day into chunks of time and divides people by ages and teaches them, divides the day by subject matters. It was at the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, and there were certain educational goals to prepare people to join the workforce. Now that we're in a different economy in the information age, the employment landscape looks very different, and many of the jobs that people hold today will be covered by robots or computers in the near future. What does that mean for our educational system as it prepares people to enter a new economy? We're also living in a historically unprecedented time of freedom as Jews, especially in North America. We all know the studies that have been done about the changing demographics, about the rates of acceptance and assimilation into the mainstream culture, about Jewish leadership and our acceptance, and the growing diversity in the American Jewish community. So what does this all mean for the future of Jewish education? How do we keep it relevant for the next 20 years? The field of education in general, in my opinion, is on the brink of radical transformation. People are rethinking schools, rethinking teaching, gaining new insights into how people learn. And tonight's topic really poses the question, against the backdrop of all of this, how does Jewish education stay relevant for the next 20 years? Where's our community heading? What are the trends in technology and neuroscience that will inform how people learn and how we should best teach? How should we structure education in response to that? Will schools continue to be structured according to blocks of time, dividing people by age and chunking it up over the course of the day? What does it mean in the Jewish community for a people of the book when the radical transformation of text with print and social media? What will the future definition of text be? How will Jewish community and Jewish identity play out in an era of multiple and fluid identities among young people? To make it even more complex, when we as a Jewish community are not all in agreement of what our educational goals are or what we want our educational outcomes to be, it makes it more difficult to figure out what we want the inputs to be and how do we assess how we're doing. I think we need to recognize that there's not uniformity and questionably even unity in the Jewish community in this day and age, and that there are so many different subgroups that have different needs with different approaches and different systems to achieve our goals. How do we as a community, in the broadest sense, with the widest lens, organize to meet the needs of all these people? So in Riverdale, we're very blessed. We really live with an abundance of resources available to us from within our community and available outside of our community. I'm excited tonight to welcome our panelists, Dr. David Breifman, Lisa Exler, and Tikva Wiener. Each has worked in the field of Jewish education for the better part of their careers, and each is currently working on some great cutting-edge work in Jewish education. It will really help define what we are aiming for and how we measure and how we know how we're doing. You have the bios. I'm not going to repeat what you can already read. I'll just add a couple of sentences about each. David Breifman is the Chief Innovation Officer at the Jewish Education Project, formerly known by old-time New Yorkers as the Board of Jewish Education, or the BJE. The Jewish Education Project has been a core agency of the UJA Federation for over 90 years, providing a wide array of educational services to New York, Long Island, and Westchester. Since coming to the Jewish Education Project, David has pioneered a number of initiatives, including the Young Pioneers Award, of which the Bayit's own Menachem Menchel was one of the first recipients. Lisa Exler is the Director of Judaic Studies at Beit Rabban Day School and the Director of the Curriculum Project, a joint project of Beit Rabban and Machon Hadar, which works on setting content standards in classical Jewish texts. Lisa has worked in formal and experiential education for 15 years. Equally important to her impressive resume is, yes, she is Rob Stevens' older sister. That's just the bonus. Tikva Wiener works at the intersection of school change and Jewish education. In addition to being the Chief Academic Officer, which is another name for a division principal at Magen David Yeshiva, Tikva is bringing project-based learning into Jewish day schools through the Idea Schools Network, which she founded as a Joshua Venture Fellow. I recently had the opportunity to participate in 2 separate events sponsored by the Idea Schools Network, and I can honestly say that the work that Tikva is leading challenges some of the very basic premises of schools and education that our community has been putting forth for generations. The format for this evening as follows. We've asked each panelist to prepare some brief opening remarks with a few sentences describing the work that they're doing in a little more detail, and I've asked them to each answer one question. What do you see as the most exciting trend or development in the world today that will help keep Jewish education relevant for the next 20 years? After the opening remarks, I'll ask each of the panelists some questions, give them a chance to ask each other some questions, and then we'll open it up to the floor for questions. Some of you have already sent questions in advance, and you all should have pencils and papers that you can write down questions as they come to your mind. You can hand them in as we go, and you'll get a chance to ask them later. So without further ado, we thank you for coming tonight. We thank the panelists for coming tonight, and I will ask David Reifman to please start us off.
Thank you. So I guess in terms of who I am is a bit of an interesting biography in terms of how I got here. I grew up in Australia, and I had two major influences in my Jewish educational development. Three, if you count my parents and family, are probably most important. I was in a classical Zionist youth movement in Hubbard and Draw for many years, and I was also at a Jewish day school, and both of those things played very important parts in my own development. I now work at the Board of Jewish Education as a Chief Innovation Officer. When my boss said to me, "You want to come and work at a central agency for Jewish education?" I said, "You've got to be kidding. There's nothing possibly new or exciting or innovative or dynamic that can happen here." And 2 weeks later, I was already working there, because he convinced me that there was a real opportunity for change, and I'll speak a bit about that. My job as the Chief Innovation Officer is really to look at trends in the outside world, i.e. those things that are happening outside the Jewish world, and see how they can be brought into the Jewish community. Not just in education, but in other fields as well. And a lot of the inputs that we've had have been from things as diverse as engineering, the arts, whatever it might be, to make Jewish education more relevant. I sort of work in the bridge between sociology and education, trying to work out where our population is at, and then try and balance that with where we want them to go. So I don't want to just meet them where they're at and give them what they think they need, because people only know what they know. But I also want to take them on a trajectory, but meeting people where they're at has become fundamentally important to me. In terms of what's most exciting about Jewish education today, it's too easy for me to say technology. It's really exciting. We don't even understand the half of what's our potential in terms of technology. But I think the thing that I wanted to focus on was that we're at a point in time now where we're at the end of what I call the bifurcation between legacy institutions and startup institutions. For the last 10 years, I think the Jewish world has been really focused on developing all of these new startup organizations, and had a whole big input into what these mean. And in some ways, there have been a lot of them that have developed, and a lot really successfully. And on the other hand, there have been these old stodgy legacy organizations that have been regarded as incapable of innovating, incapable of change, and they're just going to die a natural death. And some of them might, and some of them will. But I think now we're at a point in time where that dichotomy is now recognized as being artificial. Many of the startup organizations need these legacy organizations in order to survive, and many of the legacy organizations are really changing and doing some really great work. And I think that hybrid is happening in society today, and for Jewish education, it's probably the biggest turning point for me in terms of how innovation can come about, and then also be scaled systemically so that the whole field of Jewish education can begin to change and develop accordingly.
So I want to first thank my co-panelists and Nina and Menachem for bringing all of us together, and thank the HIR Bayit for welcoming me here, and also thank Rev Stephen actually for giving me my start in Jewish education by being a very willing and eager student to his big sister teacher who thought she knew everything and just wanted to teach it to him. So that's how I got it all started. I want to start with 3 points as an introduction, and actually first talk about two moments from my own formal Jewish education at Beth Tefillah Community Day School in Baltimore. The first is my first grade Hebrew teacher, Mr. Steinharder, who was an elderly man, or so I thought at the time, who taught us to read Hebrew, often would stand on the desk to really emphasize his point and make sure that we were getting the skills that he wanted us to get. And I remember in particular that he tasked us with learning to read Ashrei, and that he was going to time us in how quickly and accurately we could read Ashrei. So that's one early memory. And then the second one is from my 12th grade experience. My Tanakh teacher, Rabbi Danny Lehman, came in the first day and said we were going to be studying Sefer Yonah, the book of Jonah, and he asked us to go home and to read the first chapter of Yonah and to write down 20 questions that we had about the text. And I think that these two anecdotes really illustrate what is essential in Jewish education. The first is skills. We have to know how to read the text. We have to be able to read it accurately. We have to be able to read it fluently. And we can't compromise on that. And at the same time, we have to have a relationship with the text. We have to be in dialogue with it. We have to let it speak to us, and we have to be able to ask it questions. I would say, ideally, this did not happen in my own education, but ideally, those should be happening at the same time as early as first grade. And I think that you can't make the meaning out of the text without having the skills. And the skills by themselves without the meaning leaves the text somewhat irrelevant. So that's the first point, skills and meaning. The second point that I want to make is that I think that there's a trend today in Jewish day schools around educating for identity. In non-Orthodox schools, this looks like making sure that students love being Jewish, are proud to be Jewish, and won't intermarry. And in Orthodox schools, I think this looks like making sure that students stay Orthodox. But either way, it's about the identity of the student, what group the student identifies as part of, as opposed to really engaging with the content, the text, and the practices of Judaism, and asking real questions about what those texts and practices say to them and what meaning they find in them. So it manifests as like an emphasis on Judaism or Orthodoxy being fun, students loving it, but not necessarily having any real content or depth to it. And this brings me to what I want to say about relevance. And I want to challenge our assumption or our definition of relevance here. I think that we often think that making something relevant involves doing something different, innovative, or new to take something that is not relevant and make it relevant, right? Like we have to dress it up, we have to make it appealing so that students will like it, right? Which assumes that the content, the thing itself, maybe isn't relevant. And I want to reframe our thinking around that. I believe that the texts and the practices of Judaism are inherently valuable, and that it's the job of every teacher and every educational institution to give students exposure to these texts and practices, to give them the skills to engage with them autonomously so that the students can make them relevant. Every student, every person is going to have a different relationship with Judaism, with its texts, with its traditions, and students need to be able to make the relevance themselves. And I think that the only way that they can do that is, going back to the stories, is if they have the skills to do that and the practice of connecting, making the texts and the practices meaningful, engaging with them and asking questions about them. So how do we do this? And this brings me to the work that I'm doing, which is, I think we need to say and be very clear about what are the skills that students need, what is the content that they need to be familiar with, and develop standards and benchmarks around these and say, this is what students should know. These are the skills that they should have, and we're going to hold our educational institutions accountable to helping students meet those goals. Some work on this has already been done and being done in the field. In the Chabad schools, there are standards in teaching Tanakh and in teaching rabbinics. JTS also has put out standards in Tanakh and is working right now on developing standards for rabbinics. And the project that I'm doing tries to expand a little bit beyond both Tanakh and rabbinics to include tefillah and Jewish practice, which is really, I would say, mitzvot and minhagim, right? What does Jewish living look like? And really articulate for students in nursery through 8th grade right now, and hopefully, ultimately, we'll work on high school as well. What does it look like to be fluent in the texts and practices of Judaism, such that a student can engage with them independently, autonomously, and make them relevant to their own lives. And I'm doing this work kind of theoretically through Machon Hadar and practically at Beit Rabban Day School, which is functioning as kind of a lab school to actually try to pilot and implement these standards and see what we can learn from trying to live them out. I want to just close with an example of what I hope this looks like. This is actually, I'm going to read you this amazing thing that happens at Beit Rabban, which is a daily journal that comes home that's like, here's what your child did in school today. So here's what they did in 2nd grade in Chumash maybe 2 months ago. Today we focused on the challenging verse that is God's pep talk to Cain, saying that he will overcome the pain and sorrow he feels. We went through those 3 key words, ve'ata timshol bo, and each student was given a card with each of those 3 words on it. Students were tasked with translating each word for meaning. So there's the skills. We then came back and had a fruitful conversation about the ways that we exhibit self-control or not. We then looked at the outcome. Did Cain show self-control? Does God control our actions? So there's the meaning and the personal connection. It was nice to see the kids using their skills to learn the future tense, a tough at the beginning of a verb, and understanding bo from the context. So again, back to the skills. So I think that we're really, my goal is to, like I said, not wait till 12th grade for the making meaning and asking questions, but really try to bring these skills and content and meaning all together.
Hi. So thank you. This feels loud. So thank you also to Nina and to Hebrew Institute of Riverdale for inviting me here, and to my co-panelists who I'm really honored to be here with tonight. So I started in education, in Jewish education, so probably when I was 3 years old, and I haven't left since. So I've had a lot of time to ponder what Jewish education is and possibly what it should look like. I come to education and to where I currently am via a very traditional route, and I was a really good traditional student who took her notes very copiously and who was very conscientious. I was that kid who would stop a teacher and say, could you repeat that? I didn't get exactly verbatim what you said. And then it's going about 6 or 7 years ago. I don't know what caused the sea change, but it was just, I think, seeing a lot of bored, disengaged kids in school where the current system was clearly not working for them, and really starting to ask myself what would work for them, why isn't it working, what would engage them. And through those questions and through watching those students, I started to look outside in the world of secular education to find examples. And one of the best examples that I personally, or one of the examples that really spoke to me, was the work of the high-tech schools in San Diego, California. And as Nina said, she and her husband came to a screening of the film Most Likely to Succeed, which is partially about the work that the high-tech schools are currently doing. The schools are project-based learning schools. That is actually the work of the network that I run, the Idea Schools Network. I work to help schools implement project-based learning, both in the school that I'm in, Maggid David Yeshiva High School, as well as in the schools that I work with, whether it's in ongoing professional development or in one-day workshops, whether it's with whole cohorts of teachers or one-on-one with teachers. Project-based learning, PBL, is also called problem-based learning or passion-based learning. And what that means is that the learning is centered around a question or a problem that students are asked to solve or consider. And so, for example, let's say in a physics class, it might mean the students are asked, how might we use our knowledge of the laws of force and motion to create a wearable device that improves an athlete's performance? And so what that does is that it makes learning meaningful for the student right away. Larry Rosenstock, who runs the high-tech schools, he really feels passionately that no student should ever feel like they're in a class and it's like a hostage situation. Why am I here, right? And why am I learning this? If that's the question they're asking, he feels that there's a problem. And so what problem-based learning, what project-based learning does is it solves that problem. By saying, how can we immediately apply the learning to a real world context? Right away, I see that my learning has relevance, my learning has meaning in the real world. It's not, learning in school shouldn't be divorced from the real world. The other part of it is that it's fun. I mean, let's face it, it's fun to make a wearable device if you're a high school kid for an athlete. And that's another question we can ask. Why shouldn't learning be fun? Who said learning has to hurt, right? And the other thing that I think is important in the work is that, and that's the other P, which is passion-based learning, is that we always are asking, how can we incorporate student passions and interests into the learning? Because if we're not, then we're really not engaging the student on all four cylinders. Like there's an opportunity here that we're missing to play to the student's strength and to really draw the student into the learning, to lead with the strength instead of, as a friend of mine recently said, drilling on the deficit. So that's really what we're trying to do in the Idea Schools Network, is try to make learning relevant, fun, meaningful, and have a level of authenticity not only in the real world, but also, personally for the student. And I think that actually what you were saying, Lisa, is, kind of very similar in that learning should be meaningful, and it should be meaningful right away. It shouldn't be that, well, I have to wait till I go into the outside world for learning to be meaningful. As far as the educational trend, as trends in the larger world that have to do with that, I think there are so many, because what we're seeing in the larger world is, like, as Nina said, we have this device here, and it can basically, find us any kind of bit of information. And so instead of, like, for centuries, learning has been about accumulation of information, and the people who had that information were the highest, were in the highest caste. And now, well, anybody can access the information. And so what we are seeing in the outside world is we're seeing people who are saying, well, now I've got to curate the information in a meaningful manner, and that requires a different set of skills, and it might also require some interdisciplinary thinking and all of these kinds of skills, success skills or soft skills, if you will, what people might call 21st century skills of collaboration and problem solving and creativity and innovation that this current school system really isn't built for. So that's what I see as a really exciting trend that I think has a huge impact that we're only beginning to unpack in Jewish education, particularly in the area of creativity, which has certainly not gotten, I think, the honor it deserves in the classroom, and that for me personally is of immense interest and excitement, because I think that at our heart we all want to be creative.
Thank you all for your opening remarks. I'm going to ask a few questions that have been thought of already. We have a couple questions that came in advance, and then we'll open it up to audience questions. A question I think that comes up in the few conversations I've had around project-based learning or kind of theme-driven learning, right? It manifests in different ways in different schools, is the concern, right? This is what I've heard a few times. This is really exciting. It looks really engaging. The kids look like they're really into it. But what about the content? Are they still learning what they need to learn in order to get into the colleges that the parents want them to get into? And by the way, I think that is behind the question whether you're talking about second grade or 11th grade. I think that there is a concern that if you go very deep into something, or if you make it something that's relevant to outside interests, that somehow you're missing the canon, whether it's English literature or Limudei Kodesh texts. And there's a worry about sacrificing content and either breadth or depth for interest. So I'm wondering, I guess maybe Tikva, I'll start with you, but Lisa, especially I want to hear from you, and David, you can chime in too. How do you answer that? And also, what's the evidence that you've seen on the ground from the experiences you've already had?
So that is probably one of the most common questions that I get asked, content versus this. So in the movie that we saw, in Most Likely to Succeed, one of the teachers who's in the movie and who actually was at the panel for the discussion after, basically says in the movie, there is no question that my co-teacher and I do 40 to 60% of a ninth grade STEM or physics and humanities curriculum in another school. But he said, I would argue that if the students are disengaged and don't really remember the content 2 months after you teach it, then really what have you sacrificed? There is a deeper learning that goes on in project-based learning because the aim is deep learning. The aim is effective development. I'm going to, transform myself because of this learning. So I would say that that's a strong argument for engaging in this kind of work. The other part of it is, I think that PBL asks us to question why. Why are we doing this particular content? One group that I worked with in one school and this question comes up as soon as you start doing PBL. But I'm afraid that I'm not going to finish the book, whatever book it is, whether it's Sefer Shmuel, Sefer Bereshit, King Lear, whatever the textbook. In one cohort, the teacher said, "Well, I have to finish Sefer Shmuel because they have to know that Shmuel dies by the end of the year." And then in the next year, because the schools are dependent on the students knowing that, and the principal of the division said, well, can't you just tell them at the beginning of the next year, Shmuel, by the way, Shmuel died, or at the end of the year? So what I like about that, and it was flippant, of course, we went back and forth about it, but what I liked about the answer is that it provides us with a growth mindset. The answer to how is yes. So if finishing a particular anything is important, then let's work and find a way to finish it. But if you're asking why, and you're saying, well, actually, I don't need to do this or that, and then I could say, well, then that leaves us the time, because PBL does take time. And then you think about everything else you're building into the unit. Well, I'm ending with a student who can work well with others, who has empathy for group work and can, for other people in their group and values what the other people are contributing, who can contribute themselves, who's a mensch when they work, which is also, character building in Jewish educational systems. And all these other skills, if we consider those just as important as some of the content, then we're going to make room for that. And then finally, I would say actually in one of those schools that we worked with this year, and the school ended up doing a PBL unit out of a piece of the curriculum we hadn't even been touching. The teachers just got excited and got creative with it, and they ended up building a whole context into a storytelling and folktale unit that the kids had done. And even though it took a little longer, the teachers said, they were amazed immediately right after the unit by how deep the learning was, and that because the learning had been contextualized much more for the students, it became a much more powerful and meaningful learning experience. And that's exactly basically what we're saying, that it should go deep. Just because you've said the words War of 1812 in your classroom doesn't mean that you've covered content, right? So it really just is a kind of looking at a whole bunch of different aspects of the curriculum that need to perhaps actually be looked at.
Lisa, do you want to speak?
Sure. I think Look, I'm definitely one of those people who ask the question, what about the content? At the same time, I totally buy into the idea that students who are engaged are going to remember and connect with their learning in a much deeper way. I would love to imagine what are the projects in Limudei Kodesh, right? Like, what is a project that would require students to really look deeply at Jewish texts in order to solve a particular problem? And I think that if we look for those problems and those projects, we'll actually find that there are a tremendous amount of Jewish texts that we could call into play to solve problems and to create projects. So I think it's part of it is, I guess the point that I want to make is when we do project-based learning, we shouldn't throw the text out the window, right? The projects that we design should require students to turn to text, and then we need to make sure that they have the skills to utilize those texts in service of the project. I guess I'm imagining something like, I don't know, designing a guide for visiting a Shiva home, right? Or even creating an entire system for making minyanim at a Shiva home, right? And students have to learn the texts around that. Maybe they learn texts that are not just like sort of halachot about how do you act in a Shiva home, but stories from Tanakh about people and dealing with death, right? And then designing a whole system. How are we going to make sure that we're present in people's lives when we need to be, right? And that calls into play all of these texts, and at the same time shows like how everything is relevant. And then I think your point about asking the question of why. What are the texts that make up the canon? Why are those the texts that make up the canon? And how do we make sure that we are learning them? And which ones are we willing to say, like, we are giving these up in order to have these other experiences? And we believe that when students walk out the door in 8th grade or in 12th grade, they're not walking out the door of the Beit Midrash, right? They're going to come back. And if they didn't learn, you know, Melachim Aleph or Melachim Bet, and they really care, they'll come back to that.
So in the lead up to tonight, I guess everyone kept on reminding me, like, know your audience. And I'm going to answer this question by saying, like, I also want to be true to the question of the night, which is forecasting the future of Jewish education 20 years out. And in some ways, if I am here tonight, and I'm not saying I am, but to represent those Jews out there who are neither Orthodox nor going to Jewish day school, which is the vast majority of Jews out there, the Nina's question is almost an irrelevant question. Because it doesn't matter how much knowledge you give them, the knowledge itself, the text, the canon, is not what is going to continue them maintaining a Jewish life. No matter how much we might like that as an ideal, even if day school were free, these people are not going to choose to go to day school by and large in huge numbers for a whole lot of reasons that other people in this room could answer far better than I could. And therefore the question is, like, it's not what we're losing by knowledge, it's what we're losing by not offering all of these other things. So 15 years ago, I was sitting around a table with my professors and we were talking about how can we make informal Jewish education less fluffy, and now all of a sudden, Jewish summer camp and Jewish youth groups are not regarded as fluffy, they're regarded as being intensive and really important Jewish experiences, but they're not offering the same knowledge cognitively or the same text-based Jewish learning that Jewish day schools offer. So I think the question needs to be framed in terms of different settings offer different types of Jewish learning, and we're now at a time in Jewish history when the Jewish social experience, to a certain extent statistically, is even more significant in maintaining the future of the Jewish people than any corpus of knowledge that Jews might be actually studying. Now, I don't want to denigrate Jewish learning and Torah Lishma and as Jewish learning, but I do want to say that, like, For me, if a kid doesn't learn any of what we've spoken about today, but they come out with a positive feeling, whether you want to call it pride or association, or as Stephen M. Cohen says, the desire to live in a zip code with other Jews, then that's ultimately, if that's my outcome, then that's going to be far more successful as a Jewish learning enterprise. Now that's answering sociologically where Jews are at. That's not necessarily where I want them to be, but if I'm to answer the question honestly, I think that's where I'd come at it from.
So David,
I totally agree that the deep content is not for everyone, but I do want to ask, like, what happens to those Jews who don't have it, who are, who had, I don't want to call it fluffy, but who are identified as Jewish, whatever that means to them. They love being Jewish. They live in a Jewish zip code. What are they transmitting to their children and to their grandchildren that is like compelling and rooting them?
Well, history will answer that question in many ways. Yeah, so we don't fully know the answer. Statistically, if you look at the demographics, it's true, but it's not actually more knowledge that you know is going to maintain you being Jewish. Those Jews that lead halakhically observant life have a whole lot of other factors around them. They live in a neighbourhood, there's a kosher butcher, there's a mikveh, there's a shul. All of those things are still far more important than the actual knowledge that they're doing if that's ultimately your objectives. But you said before that they're not the objectives, yeah? So there are too many kids where I talk to, and I do a lot of research with Jewish teenagers, and they say, and your question before about relevance and meaning making is really important. The number of kids that go through a Jewish day school education, and the number one thing they remember from their Talmud class is oxen goring oxen. But they cannot tell you why oxen goring oxen is anything to do with any types of meaningful law, but that's the tractate that they had to learn at a certain age. So for the sake of learning in a Wikipedia age, so just to understand this point really importantly, to your point about authority before, when a high school or a college age student is given a research assignment today, the first website they go to is Wikipedia. Even though they know the information on that site might be inaccurate, they will still go there believing that the wisdom of the masses is actually more intellectually rigorous than the individual expert, and say goodbye to Encyclopedia Britannica, and in some cases it actually is. But that's their reference, that there is no single canon anymore. So the answer has to be understood in almost like a postmodern or a post-postmodern world in which these kids live. The notions of authority and canon don't register with them anymore. So I think your question opens up to all of those other pieces, which are, I think, fundamentally why you called it a revolutionary time. I think we're at a major crossroads in Jewish history right now, and Jewish education is at the forefront of that nexus there.
And Riverdale's in the nexus of the forefront of the nexus.
That is true.
David, the point that you're making reminds me of a time that I was looking at applications for the startup incubator where I was working at the time. And we had an outreach initiative that was reaching, it was like they were doing like Hanukkah at Barnes & Noble, right? And that was one of their examples of 40 families came with their kids on a Sunday to Barnes & Noble, and we threw a Hanukkah party, and they were so happy. It was like, for parents, it was a homecoming, it was the Jewish connection they had never had. Meanwhile, it's this Long Island, right? There's like a shul, within a 5-minute drive in any direction where they live. And we gave this application to a family Jewish educator, and said, can you please be our content expert on this application and tell us, is there something really exciting here? And the educator came back and trashed it. What are the educational goals? How do you know that they achieved them? What evidence do you have that anything happened other than they felt good for 2 hours? Yeah. And basically, they said, doesn't, not good enough. Yeah. Right? And that was the first time that I thought, an outreach educator and a kind of more classical educator have very different goals and measures of what a successful encounter is. And it made me stop and think, how lasting and is feeling good for 2 hours, and is that enough?
What year was that?
It must have been 6 or 7 years ago.
Okay, so
I've been gone for...
there's just something really important that we need to understand, is that up until 15 years ago, there were two types of Jewish education. There was formal education, that which took place in day schools and universities, and informal education, everything else. And supplementary schools, Hebrew schools, was somewhere in between, but usually on the formal side. That's completely broken down now, and it's related to a whole lot of different things, including what I think now is a really interesting phenomenon, that the words education and engagement in the Jewish world today have almost become synonymous. In terms of what funders are willing to fund, they don't looking at education just as education, but they're looking at ways to engage people in other ways, and there might be a hybrid in between. But what's important about what I just said is who changed the language? Who changed the goalposts of what education was? It wasn't educators, it wasn't academics, it was actually funders. And you need to understand, in terms of the whole system of American Jewry today, what's happened is, in terms of who's funding what, the federation system has declined in what they're funding, and the family foundations have now upped the ante of what they're willing to promote in Jewish life. And their understanding of what they wanted to fund was far more on the affective side of Jewish life, far more on the outreach type or the engagement type of attitudes. And now you've got a real instance where people are completely blurring the two. So I don't want to, this is not an offensive statement. I'm just putting it out there, that 10 years ago, summer camp was summer camp. It wasn't Jewish education. Now it's Jewish education. Sending books into people's lives 15 years ago would never have been regarded as education. It would have been a greater, read books to your kids. And the notion that a 10-day trip to Israel could have been a quality, significant educational experience was unheard of before Birthright came around. So all of the goalposts have changed as to now what we consider. Now you could say that's acquiescing to where the masses of Jews are, that's one. Or you could say that funders wanted more people involved in Jewish life, that's another. Or two or three, we now live in a world where what it means to be educated means something very different when most of our schools were established. And all three of those are plausible, but I think you're totally right. The rules have changed, and for us not to recognise that is a bit, mistaken.
I want to be able to open this up to the audience. One person, actually there were two questions that came in advance, and I think you all have cards and pencils and able to write down if you have questions that you want to put forth. I think the way it's going to work is Menachem's going to collect. We're going to review and kind of pick the questions that we want to invite in, and then the person will be able to ask their own question, right? Is that how we do this? All right, so if you have a question that you want to pose to any of the panelists, write it down on your note card. If you need another note card, raise your hand. You can submit more than one question. Put your name on it so that if the question is chosen to be asked, that we can give the card back to you and you can ask the question yourself. While you guys are doing that, I'm going to report in the questions that came in advance. One question is about the new development on the scene of Hebrew language charter schools, which are free public schools that are bilingual in nature. In this case, Hebrew as the second language. They are, for the most part, located in neighborhoods where public schools are not so strong, and this gives an alternative with a concentration in dual language education. I can speak more knowledgeably about the New York schools than I can about the Florida schools, and I know that there are separate networks and there are schools elsewhere as well. But this question in particular, the point of these is that there is no religious instruction given. There is Hebrew language and Israeli culture instruction, and there are other providers of Jewish content education for after schools, for example, Chabad or a JCC or other providers of the Jewish religious content that's not allowed to be provided in school. The advantage being that they are free because they are local charter schools. So I will just see, anyone want to speak to that? Okay, Tikva.
So I think appearance of Hebrew charter schools really is really connected to what David is saying, which is that we're seeing a plethora of just different opportunities for people to engage in Jewish life, and that's wonderful. Right? Because if you have more options, you can engage more people. And one of the problems, one of the issues that we have is that a lot of day schools are not affordable for a lot of people. And this offers an opportunity for people to connect to at least the Hebrew language and Israeli culture part of the day school experience, and then hopefully supplement if they are interested in doing so elsewhere. And that I think that if you connect that to what David is saying, it's really about, and really even what we were saying before about the why. I think internally, on an individual level, a lot of people are asking themselves, what is the purpose of education, engagement? Like, why am I doing what I'm doing? And it's kind of this reflective moment that we're all having, because all of the paradigms are shifting. And that's good. That's what disruption means. So I think it fits in perfectly with what we're talking about tonight, and with reimagining what the future looks like. It's wonderful that we have all these options, because then it means more people can participate in lots of ways. And one of those ways, I think Lisa's right, is there will always be people who want the content, who want to know how to read the sacred texts, and who want to engage on that level. But to limit people seems silly when we have just opportunities to widen their experiences.
I agree with that. I would add that it's not only forcing people to ask the question of what is education, or what are your goals in education, but what's the purpose of school? In other words, what do you want to get out of school? And then what can you get in other ways, either from family, from synagogue, from camp? Right, and I think that Hebrew language charter schools are forcing people to think more carefully about that. If what I want to get out of school is Jewish identity, I'm not going to get that at a charter school. If what I want to get out of school is the language skill in Hebrew, which is critically important for knowing texts, then you can get that at a charter school, and then you build the other other opportunities to supplement that to fulfill your other educational goals.
Can I say 3 quick things about Hebrew language itself, not just the charter schools? One is that if the Jewish people as a whole all spoke Hebrew fluently, I think the Jewish people would be better off. So I think that in itself is an admirable goal. But number 2, I don't know Hebrew language. I don't know how Hebrew language can authentically be taught divorced from Jewish life. And the charter schools are doing it, but I'm not sure ultimately it's possible for the entire Jewish people to do that, because that separation for me is very artificial. But the third thing, which I think is really important for me, is that if I have X number of hours to educate a child today, is Hebrew language the thing which I really want to spend my time on with them, knowing that as a community we have failed miserably in teaching our kids how to speak Hebrew? And if I had to choose between modern Hebrew or Siddur Hebrew, so a kid could graduate and pass their bar bat mitzvah, I'm not sure that Hebrew language is at the top of my list of things that I want them to actually know in the world today. So I think it's not a sexy question to ask today. Is Hebrew language still the vital cog of Jewish education? But I think it's going to be one of the next big questions that we do actually ask in the educational sphere.
Yeah, just to add to what David is saying, like Nina asked us some questions beforehand, and one of them was, what would you want to keep and maintain about the current system? And it was a really good question, and I definitely thought we should definitely teach kids how to read. Like that, I think we got that right, America. But then I'm thinking the first thing I would get rid of is Hebrew language instruction, because for the most part, we're just doing a terrible job. And if we have if we're going to rethink everything, you're talking about, the aim of tonight is to really think like staying relevant in the next, not just 20 years, but, in the foreseeable, long-term future. I mean, if we have a certain amount of time in a school day or in a learning experience, and then we have all these other things out in the ecosystem that we can take advantage of, then and it's like what Lisa is saying, why does school only have to take place in a bricks and mortar institution? right? Like, why aren't we thinking more broadly and marrying some of the, maybe birthright experience to a school so that the kids are in Israel? Because we know the best way to learn a language is by dropping people into it, right? So if we're really going to blow up the system and start anew, then we have the opportunity to just totally think outside the box.
Here's one more question that's actually a carryover from our last panel, which was very prominent, is the diversity of learners in our community and the diversity of learning styles, and how do we teach to all the different types of needs and strengths and weaknesses of students. We know that in the current system of classrooms and subjects and time chunks and grades and assessments that some kids can really fly and some kids really don't. So how do these kind of new ways of thinking, or really grounding in text skill and meaning and project-based learning and other approaches to learning take into account kids who are not typical learners or kids with challenges around certain ways of instruction? I'd like to keep that as an active theme because that really was prominent in the last session.
Sure, I'll if you want. So one of the things that actually motivates me most in this work is looking at all the learners in the classroom, because I think in traditional classrooms we know that the kids who are good with text are going to do just fine. The kids who can sit for long periods of time are going to do just fine. And I think one of the things that influenced my change was, I started to get lists when I was still teaching in the classroom full time. I started to get lists, of the IEPs and the modifications, and it started me thinking about, like, well, here I am, I've got to modify everything, but the system is the same. So the learner clearly isn't doing well with the system. So instead of changing the system, we're just going to try to force the learner into the system, and just going to be disastrous. It reminds me of a South Park where the kids are all tested. The second graders are tested for ADD by being read War and Peace. So they all test positive for ADD. So it's there's sort of this, madness to it. So I think with passion-based learning, project-based learning, you're saying from the beginning what is the strength of every student in this class, and how can I lead with the student's strength and then support the area of growth. And again, the schools that I've worked with where I've seen this happen, and these are schools where this one particular school has an inclusion program, a fully inclusive program. So the special education teacher is often sometimes leading the class. So the students with let's say the learning differences are being supported by that teacher, and often are feeling like the star already because the teacher is directing the learning to them in the multi-sensory way that they learn, and then the learning isn't happening on one modality. But then not only that, the kids get to start doing stuff in the classroom. They're getting up from the chairs, they're making stuff, they're building stuff, they're creating stuff, and suddenly the kids who were great with text maybe are not the kids who are shining, and the kids who are there, have the inclusion teacher and know the inclusion teachers for them are suddenly feeling like $1,000,000 because their spatial reasoning and their ability to create stuff and do and carve stuff or make music or do art is suddenly at the front and center, and everyone's oohing and eyeing, and they get to be the top student. So if we start privileging everything equally, I think it's going to be amazing. What we can find that, because I think we have to take into consideration the learning styles of all our students.
Lisa, can you speak to the, kind of the visual linear language texts that are the core of our teachings and how that plays out?
Yeah, I think it's a really big challenge. I would say that the standards that I have seen, standards and benchmarks, don't account for differentiation, and they leave it to the teacher. It's like, okay, here's what everybody should be doing, and now you figure out how all of these students with all these different needs in your classroom are gonna achieve this. And I think that, like Tikva said, we need to reevaluate the system. Like the classroom setting, which works really well for some a lot of students does not work well for a lot of other students. And I think we have to be much more flexible about how that learning is happening. And I actually have seen very few examples of that in Jewish text classes. I think it's a real area that we need to work on.
Okay. Okay, let's turn it to audience questions. Okay, Menachem, take it away. The microphones for broadcast and also for the recording and the live stream.
When I listen to young people, the question of the high cost of leading a Jewish Orthodox life, including schools and camp, always comes up. What is the future? What is the answer?
Who wants it?
Take it. David, I'm going to put this.
No, I can take it. It's just that Jewish life is far too expensive for the average American Jew today. And what we're demanding from people to be the required Jew is way too expensive. And the only way is for the community somehow to prioritise and subsidise it for those families that want to participate. It's simply too costly. The flip argument is also important, is that what we're offering is not valued enough by the clientele that we're trying to attract. So there's this sweet spot between what people value and what they're willing to pay for. So in terms of Jewish day school, there are many Jewish students and families that are choosing to go to other private schools other than Jewish schools. So for them, it's not economics. For them, it's another decision that's coming into the equation. And there are many ways that we can subsidise this. So finances will definitely help. But I would argue that more than finances is that the Jewish community has fallen into a bit of a lethargic state with actually showing the true value of Jewish education in the world today. And there's a shift which has taken place in terms of value, which is important, because young people, and here I say young adults, millennials, and the families of young children today, are not asking the question of what Jewish education do I need to have in order to be a better Jew today. The question of what does it mean to be more Jewish or better Jewish is it's an old question. The question that they're asking is, how can I be a successful human being in the world today? And our job is to show that Jewish education can actually contribute to that question. And if we're able to show the value of what it means to be Jewish will actually make you a more flourishing human being, then we'll have more people trying to access. And then the points of where economics and numbers will begin to have a bit more equilibrium. But we shouldn't kid ourselves that Jewish day schools are not for everybody. But that's not the only form of Jewish education, which is A, expensive, and B, open to us now. So I think the value proposition is a huge one which we have not fully explored or understood properly as well.
I think also that I agree with everything David just said. I think that if you ask millennials what they want in the world, a lot of them, like the studies that show the answer, is that they want meaning. They want meaning in their life. And that's part of also what has motivated my work. Like, well, if that's the generation we're educating, this is a great answer. This is a very Jewish answer to me. But it means that they don't want money. In other words, they're willing to sacrifice money for meaning. And so then I think the PBL, like the problem-based learning unit for all of us, is to say, how might we give them that life? How might we make the cost of Jewish living less? Because if that's what our young people are asking from us, then that's what we should do for them. And it seems if we're saying also that this is about paradigm shifting and disruption, then who says, right? And leaving behind the idea of, well, this is the way we've always done it, so that's why that's the reason it should always be so expensive, or fill in the blank. Then we have like what Ron Beghetto calls unlimited possibility thinking for ourselves, which is let's redesign it.
Another question? Good.
I think I've got the next question.
Yes.
Is this on?
It's on that we can hear you, and it's on that you're
Okay.
broadcasting.
So, first of all, thank you. I feel almost like quoting Dickens, it's the best of times and the worst of times. And we have new tools and new opportunities. And yet, the Pew study recently showed 70% of intermarriages are outside the faith unless you're Orthodox. And if you project into the future, who's left? And so I think the challenge for me is, how do we establish education in its broadest sense, not just through schools and not just through standards, to both reach and engage as well as touch souls and think about what children can do and adults can do to do Jewish. And that's the challenge that we face. And my question is,
That was mine.
what you're leaders. You focused on your particular areas, and David thinks this way. You have to think in your systems, but think outside of your systems for a second. It's a really broad challenge in American Jewry, and so I'd love to just hear your thoughts about it.
Do you want to take it first?
So I'm no longer asking the question of intermarriage being my outcome, largely because the vast majority of American Jews have already spoken. We talk to college kids on campus who identify as Jewish, and more than 50% of them have one non-Jewish parent. So we can argue that intermarriage is something we should be striving for, but for the vast majority of American Jews, that's not the outcome that they want to actually strive for. The other part of that, which is really important, if anybody of us think that the education that we provide a kid in the pre-college age is actually going to influence who they determine to marry. Like, in today's socioeconomic climate, we're kidding ourselves, yeah? The average American kid is getting married like 20 years beyond graduation from high school now. So if you actually think that what they do in 6th grade is going to influence their partners, there are other factors. I mean, what we spoke about before, if you live in a community surrounded by only Jews, which are the vast majority of modern Orthodox, and even practicing conservative Jews who live primarily in a Jewish, what some would call a Jewish bubble, then yes, there's a good chance that they're going to marry someone Jewish. And when they go to college, they'll make a choice based on the Jewish population there. So the outcome that you're asking for is not my outcome. The outcome I'm saying is that if we're actually able to show that being Jewish adds value to someone's life, and the world of positive psychology is now known as flourishing and helping them to succeed in life, then Jews and their non-Jewish partners will choose to raise their kids Jewish, because the Jewish value system, the Jewish faith-based heritage that we have, actually can contribute to make you into a better human being. We haven't been good at actually giving that message across all the time, by the way. Most Jewish education has not been aimed at those external objectives. So we do need to change the what of what we're actually talking about Jewishly to reach there. It means that we need to start thinking of being Jewish less particularistically and more as a universal value. Yeah, and it's true, other faiths can also do this, and they will, and they should. Yeah, but we happen to be Jewish. That's our people. That's our heritage. So that's our obligation. And I've got no problem if the Mormons are doing exactly the same for their population as well. But you know, being Jewish is what's important for me. But I do want to stress that the content has to change. The what of what we're teaching needs to change if they're our new outcomes. I don't want to specifically get into Shmuel, Bet, and Melachim now, but like, if I can't find a reason why Melachim is going to add relevance to someone's life today, then drop it from the vast majority of Jewish education and find something that is going to be more relevant to who they are today.
Go ahead. I think that the values and the messages that we send our children really implicitly are super important here. I think that even in very committed and Orthodox families, there's an implicit message that reading and math are more important, and science are more important than Judaic studies. I care more as a parent, I'm not speaking myself here, but I think a lot of parents, the message is we care more about the grades that you get in those subjects. They'll help you get into college. They'll set you on the right path for a good job. And we, you know, the Jewish stuff, like, yeah, we care about it. We're sending you to a Jewish school or a Hebrew school or camp or whatever, but it's clear to children that that's less important. And I think that we need to address that. I think that kids take in those messages, and if we as parents and families and communities can't make a case and communicate clearly to our children that this is just as important and we care just as much about it, then they'll make their own choices when they're independent.
I I think also what resonates for me about the question and about the way that Lisa and David have answered it is also the fact that I think the texts do have to have meaning for people. And whether you're accessing the text in their original language and have the best textual skills that you could want a day school graduate to have, right? If that text, I agree with David, if that text doesn't have meaning on some level, then I think there's a danger that you're going to go out into the world and you're going to find something that does have more meaning. And if we're investing, to get back to that value proposition, if we're investing all this time, energy, money in educating our children, then again, to go back to the why are we doing it? And if the child doesn't ultimately see that text has value and that they have something to contribute as a human being to the world and as a Jew in the world, then I think we have failed. And even if you're not accessing the text in the original language, then maybe we have to ask ourselves if we can still do the same things. We could still make the text relevant. A lot of times it does come back to then, if an ox gores an ox, and it's like, why am I doing this? What is that? And there is an answer, and there is an application today, and then that begs the question, well, why don't we ever get to that point? Right? Is it because we feel like we have to cover content, and so we never get to the why, and we never ask children to reflect on what they're doing and who they're becoming as they go through this process? Then I feel like we've missed a big opportunity. And then the other part of the question is, if we're thinking about the communities that are getting it right and maybe have higher retention rates, and maybe the communities, if a goal in our Jewish world and our ecosystem in general in North America or the world is to retain our people, then maybe we can de-silo some of our communities from each other and say we have what to teach each other, and the people with the text skills and the knowledge of the text should be reaching out and connecting to the world and with and giving and providing access and the reason why to those who don't have it yet.
It's sort of Lewis went straight for the Holy Grail. He went straight for intermarriage as the outcome. In most Jewish sociology studies, like before you get to intermarriage, the behavioural outcome or output, which is spoken about more commonly or not, is lighting Shabbat candles, as if that's an indicator of future Jewish life. And like, if we actually think that lighting Shabbat candles is a measure of something, then I think we as a community have something to question ourselves on. That being said, when I was doing a research on the meaning of Shabbat candles, and you begin to find out that the Shabbat candles is not actually about the lighting of Shabbat candles, but it's about Jewish families having some sort of Friday meal together, and all that symbolizes around it, and all of a sudden the Shabbat candles becomes a really important and salient feature of a lot more in Jewish life. But that's usually the whipping boy of social science in the Jewish world.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the panelists for very provocative, interesting topics. And I want to follow up on the special needs children, the children who have learning issues. We heard from the Shefa School principal at the last forum and on all the wonderful programs in place in that school. But unfortunately, there are not enough schools, and the trend in secular education is to integrate kids with autism, kids with special learning challenges back into the classroom, sometimes with extra help from special education teachers. So how can we do that in our Jewish day schools? That's my first question. With these children, they are just as valuable to our society. They often have very special talents that will see them through in the future, and we need to nurture them and keep them in the Jewish community. So that's the first part. How can every day school incorporate these children? Not just the Shefa School, and also, why is there no central agency that helps parents? Because the parents of these children are so frazzled from all the things that they have to do medically often, as well as socially. Why isn't there a place that helps parents to find the right integrated program that's near their community? Right now, there isn't any.
Okay, I'm going to exercise the moderator's privilege looking at the clock and see if there's a few other questions that we can collect, because I think we're probably only going to have time for maybe one more before we close.
Hi, I want to thank you. I especially appreciated that even though you're all aiming to strengthen the future of Jewish education, you really are coming from very different perspectives. I think that was very interesting. My question is the forecasting part of the talk. How do you see the changes that you are discussing and advocating shaping the Jewish community of the future?
Let's do one more question, and then we'll...
Yep. Thank you. It's been very interesting. Getting back to the question of values and the question of finance, the question that comes to mind is, and it makes me think of one particular school, an Orthodox day school in Manhattan, that I know people attended 50 years ago, and it had a wonderful reputation then, as it does today. But many day schools, because of their expense, have an emphasis or a value on money and material. Students having birthday parties at the Rainbow Room, drivers taking the kids out Motzi Shabbat. Is that a Jewish value? And is this the environment that we want to expose our children to?
Okay, so I would say after these questions, I'm just going to pick to ask the part 2 of the question about what supports are available to parents who are struggling with figuring out the right educational opportunities for their children with special learning needs. Let's start with that, and we'll see if we have time for one more. David, I'm going to look to you on this only because I'm hopeful that the Jewish Education Project might be part of an answer to that. No. But I know we were talking about this after the last one about the Jewish Board used to offer some services, but that has been closed.
Your question is highly problematic and highly sensitive on many communal issues. So number one is to educate and to integrate a child with special needs costs significantly more than a kid with so-called normal needs in a school, and we need to recognise that there are costs involved, which is not an excuse, it's just a reality much of the time. The second part of your question, which is really problematic, is who are the educators in any of these settings that are being trained to deal with any of these issues? And I would argue that the biggest issue which we need to deal with in terms of forecasting is none of what we said is actually relevant if we don't train a whole generation of educators to take this mantle forward, whether it's kids with special needs or not with special needs. So, I mean, these educators are critical to this whole discussion. We haven't actually spoken about educator training tonight, but that's part of the answer to your question. But the third part is that when communities with intentionality want to integrate children with special needs, we now have examples in the real world of Jewish education where it's been successful and it's done really, really well. And here I look specifically to the summer camp movement, and Dan can talk more a bit about this, but there are summer camps that are now, with intentionality, developing programs with separate streams and integrated streams. They know how to do it, they know how to do it well. There are Israel Experience programs that take kids with special needs. So we do know how to do it, and there are foundations and support to make it happen. So I think the answer to your question is actually one of vision more than anything else. The question of how do parents find out is far more problematic. There's no central address, and there's also no one willing to pay for a central address to occur. But the flip side of that, which is sort of important today to understand, is how do most parents find out about most decisions they make about their children? It's actually through their social networks, primarily that are taking place on technology today. So maybe there needs to be an investment in Facebook groups to help answer your question, but that's the reality of how parents are making most of their decisions today. They don't actually want or look for a central agency anymore to help them with those decisions, but that's another piece of the puzzle.
I do want to actually talk about the work of my fellow, JVG fellow, Dana Kyle, who runs an organization called Room on the Bench, which is all about how to create fully inclusive classrooms. And I definitely think if we're talking about a huge paradigm shift, that's what we're aiming for. It definitely drives my work in project-based learning because I do think it creates an environment. Lisa and I were talking earlier about what are the proper learning conditions to support all learners, and it naturally creates an environment where that would be possible. And Dana's work is exceptional. Dana's so knowledgeable, and I highly recommend her. And I think this is the next frontier for us. in the education world. I think every teacher should have special education training, and that it should be a natural part of the classroom. It shouldn't be separate. It should be an inclusive environment. When we were at the high-tech schools getting training, a Columbia professor named Chris Emden, you should watch his TED Talk, it's very entertaining, said we lose so much brilliance by doing things the way we've always done them. I think that's true, It's poignant, but true.
I'm mindful of the time, and I want to thank all of our panelists for bringing your full selves and your full passions to this conversation. The question about being relevant 20 years out really begs the question of what do we want the community to look like 20 years out, and then how do we plan backwards to get the structures and supports in place to get us to where we want to go. We're at such a time of rapid change and innovation, and the question of how to take all the research and experimentation that's happening inside the Jewish community and outside the Jewish community and figure out how to find homes and settings for all of this. I think it's really an exciting time, and I think that this question really stimulates us to think about and dream about what the possibilities are that lie ahead. So thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you very much to all of our panelists. And thank you to the Bayit for creating an environment where we can honestly and authentically tackle some of the biggest challenges that our community faces.